the Zero RB Universe post NFL Week 14 as we look ahead to the fantasy football playoffs. There is some very intriguing names, Shawn, making the list this week as some of those late round guys have started to make a position. Even some of the undrafted names have started to push their way into potential starting in fantasy as they get into the reality lineups. Shawn, I guess we better kick things off by looking at one of the names who, pushed us right over the line and essentially saved our season when it comes to the FFPC main event. People knew that we had to win to get in. We won against the number 1 seed in the semifinals. That meant we were facing the number 2 seed in the finals. Another game, Shawn, where it was an absolute shootout between both sides. The semifinal or the third, fourth place playoff, highest scoring team was 135 points over on that side. But this was 171 to 166. And it was pretty close coming down the stretch. We mentioned on the Monday podcast ahead of Monday Night Football that we had Chase Brown left to play against Jamar Chase. And I was considerably nervous, even though that we had a 26-point lead, Shawn, heading into this one. This was a team, Shawn, that I don't think many people would have been able to overcome this week based on the fact, not just that we started Will Levis, which was, we had to do it. We had 2 quarterbacks on bye, Shawn. We had the decision, though, between Will Levis and Bryce Young. We went the Will Levis route. We went up against Puka Nacua and his 41.8 points. Then we went up against Jamar Chase and his 46.1 points. But we still managed to get over the line thanks to those 24.3 points from Chase Brown to win our league championship. We advance now to the sprint. Hopefully we make a little bit of a fun run here over the next couple of weeks to have a shot at it. I think the team's pretty well positioned. We get Nico Collins back this week and we get to see what happens moving forward. But Monday Night Football, Shawn, you really threaded a needle. You and Ben talked on Stealing Bananas this week about having a team that needed to overcome Puka Nacua, but that had Chase Brown, and you managed to just crawl over the line in that one. Monday Night Football, absolutely wild. Chase Brown, in a game where you would normally be like, yeah, Chase Brown got 24 points, he went off. That doesn't count this week, Shawn. We talked about Jordan Addison on the Monday show. He had 39 points. We're talking about Puka Nacua. He had 41, 2 highest scoring wide receivers of the week. Nobody's going to overcome that. Jamar Chase decides that he's going to put up 45 on the Dallas Cowboys and gets that late touchdown to push some of his teams over the line. I know there'll be a lot of people who went against him. I had a team with Zachary Kruger that did get caught by, I think, 1.5 points that faced off against Jamar Chase in the Superflex contest. But these are the things that happen. Hopefully the people out listening had some good fortune over the weekend as we move into the fantasy playoffs. We'll talk about some of the running backs coming up that are going to be a big part of that. But Shawn, main event, regular season over, into the sprint, into the best ball playoffs. So many teams getting across the line. I had some, as I mentioned, some daggers that didn't get over the line because some teams then that also sneaked their way in. So week 14 was a challenge with the bye weeks. It did hurt me a little bit on those teams that could have advanced. But how are you feeling as we shape up for the most exciting time of the fantasy season? Trademarked. We use that at many intervals of the season, but this is going to be exciting as we head into the fantasy playoffs.
We enjoy fantasy, so there are a lot of exciting times. Colm, you mentioned the teams that didn't quite get across the line. I was looking at my FFPC Best Ball teams, 30 entries, 8 advance, but 5 third place finishes, and you're always looking at those thinking what might have been. Certainly I'm very happy with the way that portion turned out. Got a nice message from Peter Overset relating that 4 of our 18 Best Ball Mania teams from the Best Ball Breakfast shows had advanced. Excited about those. Some of those teams are pretty unique, so that will be a lot of fun to track going forward. Colm, you and I did one Best Ball Mania Resurrection League for the show. That team did win first place, so it is now in the mix for the final 3 weeks for that prize over there. Ben and I did a couple of eliminators for Stealing Bananas, and one of those is still live heading into week 15. It's absolutely loaded and also has Isaac Garendo, so hopefully he plays tonight. So many different fun things going on. You were mentioning teams that just got caught or just didn't. Curtis, Patrick, and I have what now is kind of an old school Dynasty team because it's an FFPC Dynasty Superflex team before the RotoViz Triflex format came into place. And we won by less than a point with Jamar Chase on the final night, and that allowed us to clinch the number 1 seed in a league where I think the top 3 teams were so close that if we don't get that point, we don't get the 2 victory points, I'm not even sure we would have been a bye team, right? So if you win the bye, obviously you get a little bit of money immediately, but then also you don't have to play this week. And so that is a huge part. It was a lot of fun to clinch that. And then the team that I've mentioned from time to time with Bjorn, who does such fantastic work, that may be the best Dynasty team that I've ever had the chance to be part of putting together. That team cruised to the number 1 seed. So of the 8 FFPC Dynasty teams, 7 advanced. Colm, the only one that didn't is the one that you and I have done the Reanimators shows with. Our orphan that we adopted last year, started 0-5, finished 7-7. We were just looking at it right before the show, and it turns out that we essentially didn't make it by 1.5 points in one of the other matchups. We needed the team that ended up finishing 5th to lose because we couldn't pass the team that finished 6th. They were playing head-to-head anyway. That's a little Byzantine, but basically, if a different matchup that went within one, and it kind of looked like both teams were trying to not make it. The final score was 112 to 111. We Colm had a good team. We wanted to make it. Now we're going to have to try and win the toilet bowl. That portion, always a lot of fun in FFPC as well. I'm going to go ahead and throw out this pitch as you're getting ready to decide how many orphans you adopt next season. FFPC Dynasty, absolutely fantastic. The best place to play.
But we're into the fantasy football playoffs now. We've got to see how it all runs over the next couple of weeks in Dynasty and Best Ball and all the different ways. So it's always fun to have a combination of those, as you kind of touched on a moment ago, and see how it all plays out. But we're going to have to go for that number 1 seed, Shawn, to save your Dynasty reputation. I can't believe that the one team that we didn't get through was our team here. But we got 1 in, 1 not in. Let's get a 101 and a 112. I think that's the way to finish off those 2 seasons. Shawn, the player, though, that I do want to touch on, I did mention Chase Brown at the start of the show. He got us that, enough points just to sneak it over the line this week in the main event championship. He has 58 rushing yards, 65 receiving yards, 6 receptions, and of course the touchdown on that 19-yard reception. Obviously, we had Zach Brown at the start of the season mixed in. He is no longer there. We had some Khalil Herbert this week in the game, but if we look at over the course of the last 5 games since Zach Moss went down for the season, he's 22.7 PPR points per game. He's at a 26-point game, 24, 19, had the bye week, 19 again, and then 24 this past week. So he's putting up extremely strong numbers. Started the season slowly, had competition in the backfield. Also, I think was banged up, working his way back to full health. He has looked excellent over the last couple of weeks. Is that something that you expect that he is going to be able to maintain now through this playoff stretch?
I do. Certainly, you think the Bengals probably regret their touch split prior to the Moss injury. Now, that doesn't mean Moss not playing at all. I'm sure they would also love to have a little bit of a breather back in there. They like him for pass blocking, all of those types of things. You get a slightly different look as Moss is a little bit more of a tackle breaker, where Chase Brown is unbelievably explosive. But we saw again this past week with that controversial play down the sideline where Chase Brown, he has the kind of speed that only probably 4 or 5 backs in the NFL possess. He hits the line harder than most of those backs do. So when you're talking about the ability to stress a defense, the ability to create a big play, the ability to have a guy go out in the passing game and perhaps run a downfield route and score a touchdown, Yeah, they don't love
They
him.
did target him downfield again against the Cowboys, but it was incomplete. But he's used in such a variety of ways, and also the part to factor in is you're looking at having T. Higgins and Jamar Chase as like people that also have to be covered.
Yeah, no, it puts a lot of stress on the defense. He lines up out wide. He sprints down the field into the back corner of the end zone. The defensive back is able to knock away a pass that was just barely late. One of the things that I discussed with him in the Zero RB Candidates Countdown in August was how much work he had done to improve himself as a receiver. Now, some of the elements of that puff piece or the various puff pieces describing his offseason work, may overstate, what he truly can do. Is he going to catch that pass even if it's not batted away? Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. But the ability to run a few routes, the speed that he can run those routes with, and then the possibility that he would haul in a downfield target, all of those things help. So even though, ideally he's not back there pass blocking too often, this is a playmaking back that most teams don't have. You contrast it with what the Kansas City Chiefs are getting from their backs, for example, and the Bengals offense now with a game breaker versus a back, more like the Kareem Hunt, Isaiah Pacheco duo that Kansas City has, that Zach Moss type of play. It completely changes how an offense works. It's also a situation where he's the beneficiary of just how good Joe Burrow is and just how dynamic that combination of especially Jamar Chase, but then also T. Higgins. The defense can't really load up to stop him. He can't be the defensive focal point in the way that backs like Josh Jacobs and Joe Mixon will hopefully be the defensive focal point as we go into the fantasy playoffs here. Now we know that those backs are also going to be the focal point of their respective offenses, Colm, in a way that Chase Brown, even right now, probably is not. And yet, this is one of the most valuable roles in the NFL currently. We talked a lot this season about how few injuries there have been. Unfortunately, a handful of those injuries have actually occurred to players that are crucial for the RV community. Players like a Breece Hall, a Kenneth Walker, a J.K. Dobbins, and even most recently a Bucky Irving. Hopefully Bucky is going to be mostly okay for these next 3 weeks. Maybe they hold him out this week and he's dynamic in 16 and 17, and you have enough depth to overcome maybe one missed game. But this situation here where Zach Moss does go down is one that has massively unlocked Chase Brown to be, maybe a top 5 back as we head into the fantasy playoffs. Since he started that run that you mentioned, Colm, among all flex eligible players, only Jamar Chase and Saquon Barkley have outscored him. That's the top 2 guys in all of fantasy.
Yeah, the other thing, when we're looking at offenses that some of these running backs are in and how the offenses move, at the moment, there's not many better environments than the Cincinnati Bengals. Joe Burrow's playing really well. The defense is playing really bad. They're having to put up a lot of points. We mentioned a few weeks ago that they lost multiple games, putting up over 30 points this season. The last couple of games, against Dallas, it is only 27 points that they've been up. They've been up 38 against Pittsburgh, 27 against the Los Angeles Chargers, 34 against Baltimore, 41 against the Raiders. They're putting up a lot of points in an environment that's going to continue here, hopefully, over the next couple of weeks. They get some interesting matchups this week, obviously getting the Titans, then the Cleveland Browns, then the Denver Broncos. So I would expect that those are games that the Broncos the Bengals should be leading from the front, which I'm hoping leads to a favorable environment again for Chase Brown. Shawn, the next player that I wanted to discuss a little bit was Chuba Hubbard. We mentioned there, you listed off a couple of injuries. One of the very unfortunate injuries, over the last couple of weeks has been Jonathan Brooks injuring, and tearing his ACL again. Obviously, when you come into the season, that was something that he had coming from college. The team kind of waited, taking him back in. Then a non-contact injury this past week rules him out. Hubbard has looked very, very good. He's got the new contract. He's been scoring. I've quite a bit of Hubbard on some dynasty leagues over the last couple of seasons, so he's been very valuable in those situations. It looked like maybe they were going to, start to really share some work together. The offense has improved since Bryce Young has come back in. Hubbard now is set up to really control that entire backfield and have all the work that he can handle in an improving offense. What's your thoughts of him over these next kind of 3 weeks for the fantasy playoffs?
Well, Hubbard had the most expected points in the entire NFL last week. He does finish with almost -10 fantasy points over expected because he stuffed on a couple of carries from the 1 yard line, but he does eventually punch in a score on one of those drives as well. He's going to be going up against a Dallas defense this week that obviously gave up the big Chase Brown game on Monday night, but it's also been eviscerated by Joe Mixon, Bijan Robinson. In that span, they did limit Saquon Barkley, but this is a perfect matchup to really get off to a roaring start.
First time, Shawn, I believe, in 2 seasons that the Panthers have been favored going into a game. I think it's over 30 games that they've been the underdog. So shaping up, things might be starting to turn around here for Carolina.
Well, it's certainly a situation where you love what Bryce Young is doing. Colm, after we made the call to go ahead and start Will Levis instead of Bryce Young last week, we then cut Young so that we could pick up the other pieces that we needed. We had added Sincere McCormick. We were wanting to make sure that we could get to the 2 kickers. Kicker injuries have actually been more frequent this season than at some of the other positions. I certainly regretted playing Levis in that game, even though against that elite Philadelphia Eagles defense, Young doesn't score that many points given the miss from Leggett at the end. But
still almost scored twice the points of Will Levis, though.
Which, very easily could have made the difference. Colin, one of the things I like about our main event team is that we're probably going to be starting Drake May. That is a weakness in that most of the teams in the sprint are going to be starting better quarterbacks. At the same time, May has flashed this elite fantasy upside that, if it comes to fruition during the sprint, could be something that sets our team a little bit apart. But I do regret the fact that not only we didn't start Bryce Young, but we did cut him, because it feels now as though he might be the guy in one of these games over the next 3 weeks who might have been the play for us. I mentioned that resurrection team that is a Gibbs, Kenneth Walker, who again doesn't necessarily look like he is going to play, but a Gibbs, Walker, Chase Brown, Tyrone Tracy team fired up to have Chase Brown. He was obviously one of the drivers of that success. Colm, the other 2 guys who finished near the top of the EP leaderboard last week, you have a superstar, you have a 0 RB breakout, Devon Achane, 29.1. He also gets the -10 because he has so many goal line stuffs. He carries 4 consecutive times from inside the 3 on the initial drive, but does finally score. He has a 4th quarter carry from the 1 where he loses 3 yards. Averaged 1.7 yards per carry this week, but still earns the 7 targets and gains the 45 receiving yards. By contrast, Zach Charbonnet adds almost 10 fantasy points over expected to his blazing EP numbers. The 51-yard run, all of those receptions. Sports Info Solutions had 128 of his 134 yards after contact, which again basically tells you that
that's all of his yards, Shawn. Just say all of his yards after contact.
It is. It means someone touched him on that 51-yard touchdown run where, that looks like a before contact run to me. But again, those count and are important. You need to be able to make those big plays. He had 6 evaded tackles, which is a lot. At the same time, as we're kind of thinking about what this is going to mean going forward, Seattle's run game is ranked dead last for the run game. The run blocking unit is dead last in the SIS PE numbers, the points earned there. He carries 22 times. He's hit at the line on 12 of them. He's stuffed 9 times. So some of these issues that we're seeing with Kenneth Walker, where Kenneth Walker leads the NFL in evasion rate, but has been a little bit frustrating over the previous month, those issues didn't entirely go away, but Charbonnet's specific plays, which in some ways can be fluky, but also the profile, the attack that he had when he's confronted with that context was very successful in week 14. And I like the way it's going to look going forward. The flip side of that is that we've been talking about James Cook, right? And how the expected points numbers for him are not really there, and that he's been thriving on fantasy points over expected. But then you get this game with the Rams where game script is a little bit of an issue, and he comes in under on FPOA. That's the type of game I think that you're really worried about if you're playing James Cook right now, because they prefer Ty Johnson on some of these important passing downs, and he's the one who gets the 41-yard TD to help Buffalo get back in the game. It was also a little bit disconcerting that Ray Davis had quite a few routes in this game, even though right now he is not factoring in much. Colm, that's going to be a little bit of a fluky game, but as we go through these matchups, as we talk about specific scenarios that could play out in week 15, this game against the Detroit Lions, the headline game of the week, maybe the headliner for the entire season. The Lions score in bunches. They could put up a big number like we got from the Rams, and their defense shuts down both rushing and receiving to the backs. How concerned are you about James Cook in a game where you both have a defensive unit that, even with some of the injuries, is probably going to be able to handle these backs, and a context in which the Bills could again be chasing?
So the one thing, facing the Lions, everything you said there I would agree with, but we look back to, say, the Packers game this past week. The Packers tried to do it, and we kind of agreed that maybe it wasn't the right way to do it, on the ground in those situations. So depends on what game script we get into. I was a little bit surprised as to how quickly the Bills went away from Cook this past week. Obviously, they got into a hole early, but it was a sort of situation I was wondering, is he banged up on the sideline? What's going on? But then when the game got closer at the end, they had him kind of straight back in and using him again. So it was a little bit unusual that way. The other thing with the Ty Johnson thing, Shawn, he had the 41-yard receiving touchdown this week. Back in, it seems like a long time ago now, but back in week 2, he had a 33-yard receiving touchdown. They do like to kind of use him in some of those situations. So that little bit of a squeeze on Cook is definitely concerning as we move forward in the games that they're going to have here over the next couple of weeks. It's hard to go in with full confidence. I think if you're in a redraft situation, a dynasty situation where you have to start a player, you may have additional, better running back options. But I do think a lot of teams out there that are led by Cook are going to be, teams that are going to have to start him here in the playoffs and not have that particular option. They get the Lions in that dome game this week. Then they get the New England Patriots. Then they get the Jets. I think he's still going to be a strong play over the course of the rest of the weeks here. The difficult thing for him is a bit like we talk about with Saquon Barkley and those goal line situations when you have Josh Allen. Even when you get to the 20-yard line with Josh Allen, there is going to be a lot of times where he is the design play, or it's going to be a passing play, and it just limits some of the upside, as you mentioned, with the EP numbers. The other thing, Shawn, I did want to mention before we wrap up our Chuba conversation, he is a very favorable schedule. We touched there on facing the Cowboys this week, but they also face Arizona, who you touched on the issues that the Seattle Seahawks running backs, or mainly Kenneth Walker, have been having in terms of their offensive line play this year. I would also say that quite a part of that performance is down to Arizona's defense and the struggles that they may have here as we continue to close out the season. So he gets Dallas, then Arizona, then at Tampa Bay. So Chuba is set up, I think, really, really strong over these next couple of weeks as we work our way through the playoffs. Shawn, the New York Jets we talked about last week, and I felt that it was going to be much more Braylon Allen, less Isaiah Davis. It wasn't going to be a 50-50 split or anything like that in the absence of Breece Hall. That wasn't the case, and Isaiah Davis also had a strong performance in this one. Is that a sign here of things to come if we do miss out on Breece Hall over the coming weeks? And then if Hall is back, is that going to mean that we have even a bigger squeeze on Allen as the second option here for the next couple of weeks with how Davis played? Were you impressed with what we've seen, particularly this past week? There's more of a sample size there.
Yeah, he's a guy that we really love going back to draft season. And now he's had a chance to flash. They've seemed to like him a lot in the receiving game. This is a guy who,
you know what, it strikes me, Shawn, as a longtime Green Bay Packers fan who's spent a lot of time listening to Aaron Rodgers over the years. This feels like a player that Aaron Rodgers likes.
That could be true. That could be true. If you play on a Rodgers team, you need to get on his good side. But no, he played well. He evades 3 tackles. He scores the rushing touchdown, averages 3.3 yards after contact. He looks good in the receiving game. He's a little bit more multifaceted, a little bit more explosive than Braylon Allen. And so I think it'll probably be a dead even mix. What you're looking for then is who is going to get in the end zone. That probably still does skew a little bit in favor of Allen. I think you can play either guy if you need a back. The problem comes in if Allen is faced with, as you just mentioned, Hall, where I don't know that Breece Hall is really a running back one if he plays in the fantasy playoffs. You're probably going to be in a situation where you have to play him. He's simply too good. He's the guy who got you here, even though his season at times is or has been pretty frustrating. Colm, I was going through the 7 teams that I had advance in the main event, and in some ways it was almost surprising that 2 of those teams were Breece Hall picks early. The teams are deep enough to not have to play running backs in the flex. They have other running back options. One of those teams scored 182 points last week with both Breece Hall and Kenneth Walker out. And so that's what you're looking to do, is build squads that do have some depth. And yet, in some ways, that's almost the nightmare scenario, is that you get one of these guys back, you play them, and because they're not 100% yet and their backups have looked good. I mean, this was a pretty catastrophic week for Hall and for Kenneth Walker, where it's not just that they didn't play, but their backups looked so good and did some of the things that they've been really struggling to do. I think that if you are the Jets offensive coaching staff, certainly if you are Robert Saleh and you were fired, at least in tiny part, I think, because of your consistently veiled shots at Breece Hall, but he's sitting back there, it's like, yeah, see, I wanted to play Braylon Allen and Isaiah Davis here. They're the guys who work the best for what we want to do. I really think that the Jets have to trade Breece Hall in the offseason. They've taken these backs. They both look like hits. They need a lot of things. You consider the situation that we got with all of these running backs recently. It'll be interesting to see, Colm, I mean, this is very apples to oranges, but the free agent market for some of the biggest MLB stars a year ago was very, very soft. And then the Dodgers went out and flagrantly bought a World Series championship. And now MLB free agent dollars are absolutely exploding through the roof. You go out, you spend enough, you show that it'll work. We're like, oh yeah, we can buy players. Why were we not buying players? Like, 2/3 of these teams are owned by consortiums that have billions of dollars. Why are we not spending that money? Saquon Barkley's success this season, Joe Mixon's success this season, Josh Jacobs' success this season, that's not going to make it easier for teams to extend, re-sign, what have you, players like Breece Hall. That's a little bit of a tangent, obviously, but I don't think that Breece Hall is in the long-term plans for the New York Jets. In many ways, I think you would just love to see Isaiah Davis. Well, if you add him to the back of your teams last week, if you don't have him, you don't want to see it. But him going off in the fantasy playoffs, I think, is a very real possibility.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Hall situation. I think if you're looking at it like from a dynasty asset aspect, which maybe the team are, they have added in 2 rookie running backs this season behind him. It would make a lot of sense for them to potentially try and trade him, get some more capital, continue to improve the team here as they move forward with two running backs that I think are very capable in that backfield. Shawn, Sincere McCormick was somebody who we touched on last week, but then he gets the shot. He has a pretty impressive performance, and now he has been named the starting running back for the Las Vegas Raiders. Gets the start here as we move into the playoffs. Again, a little bit like the question with Isaiah Davis from what we talked about last week to where we are now. What do you think the situation looks like for McCormick? Obviously, we have a quarterback change happening with the Raiders as well. We talked a little bit about our concerns with that for Brock Bowers moving forward. But what all is the look ahead here for Sincere McCormick? Gets the Falcons, gets the Jaguars, and gets the Saints. All pretty nice matchups here as we move forward into the playoff.
He's the number 1 ranked back in terms of fantasy football playoff schedule. That matters. And I think at times it especially matters at the running back position where you have both tactical considerations, how do teams want to play the opposing running game? And then just, what's the personnel? Do they have the guys to make stops? And then even game environments. The Atlanta Falcons are probably not going to blow you out. Your back is going to be involved the whole game. The Jacksonville Jaguars are not going to blow you out. Your back is going to be involved the whole game. And this current version of the New Orleans Saints, although maybe Derek Carr is able to play by week 17, I mean, they're talking about both Carr and for the Raiders, Aiden O'Connell playing this week, possibly. Again, as we record on Thursday morning, those things are up in the air. You probably would expect the backups to go, but they are. Yeah, I mean, there's at least some rhetoric, maybe some gamesmanship about the other guy being able to get out there. But the Raiders are going to be in all 3 of these games. Sincere McCormick had the best positive percentage of any back in the NFL last week, again, among guys with double-digit carries, players who did have a little bit of a sample. He had a 20% evasion rate, 4.1 yards after contact per attempt. He drew 3 targets, even though he ran 7 fewer routes than Amir Abdullah. This is tough, right? Because if you do have guys who have played the whole season and played pretty well, maybe they have a bad matchup, maybe they're a little bit dinged up. You don't know if they're going to play an entire game. Maybe they have been on a little bit of a cold streak, and so their projection is now in that range that makes you nervous. Sincere McCormick has the potential to put up a 20-plus game. He's going to get a good workload. If you get in the end zone, then suddenly your score is very viable, even for good teams, right? Even teams that are competing in the fantasy playoffs. The problem is just that the Raiders are not very aggressive. We were pretty frustrated with their unwillingness to go on 4th down last week. If you're not aggressive, your offense isn't good, your quarterback isn't good, you're not going to score a lot of points. That means that a lot of other backs who are probably similarly talented or have similar workloads have a much better chance at a single touchdown, but also a much better chance at those multi-touchdown games. And just any time that you're trying to rely on someone, or really we've only seen it for a week, maybe 2 weeks, it's nerve-wracking, right? You don't really know what you're going to get.
And that is where we're going to close it off for this edition of RotoViz OT. Hopefully everyone that's involved in their fantasy playoffs, I assume generally, Shawn, we get to this point, the people listening in are in contention, but hopefully they are ready for another W in week 15. That's what we're hoping for our teams, your teams, as we move forward here towards the end of the season. If you are interested in signing up over at rotoviz.com, you can use the code RVRadio2024 at checkout to get yourself a 10% discount off a 1-year RotoViz NFL pass. That will get you access to all the content and tools up on the website. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. You can follow me at Blue Sky at Overtime Ireland. You can check out all of Shawn's work, including the Zero RB universe, up on rotoviz.com. Until we are back, have a good one.